Good evening, Europe, and good morning, Australia, or vice versa, depending on where you're watching this from. My name is Jess Carniel, and I'm from the University of Southern Queensland in Australia. Yes, that controversial Eurovision participant. In this video, I'm going to explore the politics of fairness at Eurovision with a focus on both the rules of the song contest and on fan perceptions of fairness. In this, I hope to explore three main questions with you. How do politics affect fairness at Eurovision? How do fans perceive fairness and unfairness at Eurovision? And are rules a sufficient means for maintaining fairness? I've got Dummy In pictured here as an example of unfairness at the song contest. But first, how do we define fairness? If we take a Rawlsian approach to the idea of fairness, which I do in this video, it's fundamentally linked to the concept of justice and vice versa. According to Rawls, fairness can be understood as the right dealing between persons who are cooperating or competing against one another. This sounds like a lot like Eurovision to me. He further explains that a practice will strike the parties as fair if none feels that by participating in it, they or any of the others are taken advantage of or forced to give in to claims which they do not regard as legitimate. For a practice to be fair, it must satisfy the principles of those participating, and participants must be able to speak of and support their own positions. In other words, it must meet certain agreed upon values and criteria, and all must be able to speak openly and to query how those values play out in practice. Furthermore, rules suggest that by engaging in fair practice, participants generate prima facie duties and rights, specifically the duty to act in accordance with the practice and the right to expect others engaged in the practice to also submit to the rules. Now, if fairness is about establishing and acting according to agreed upon rules and principles, that should not lead to one group being taken advantage of by another or of having to act in a manner that compromises those principles, what then is unfairness? Interestingly, Rawls argues that unfairness is not necessarily about rule breaking, but rather taking advantage of loopholes or ambiguities in rules, availing oneself of unexpected or special circumstances which make it impossible to enforce them, insisting that rules be enforced to one's advantage when they should be suspended, and more generally acting contrary to the intention of a practice. Rawls is, of course, ruminating on how to create a fair and just society, but how might his ideas be applied to the Eurovision Song Contest? Eurovision is an event that people, broadcasters, artists, the EBU are cooperating on for the purpose of competing with each other. One of the ways it seeks to manage the right dealing, as Rawls puts it, between these entities is to have a clear set of rules that are agreed upon by the host broadcaster, the EBU, the Eurovision Reference Group, and by extension, all the participating broadcasters and artists. The purpose of the rules is to ensure that everyone is working within the same parameters, which aim to ensure that everyone has a fair opportunity with the bounds that the contest can control. For example, everyone must have a song no longer than 3 minutes. The song can't be released or publicly performed before the 1st of September. Everyone must perform the vocals live, and the performance must be identical each time it's staged. What the contest rules can't control are things like individual countries' budgets that might enable them to be more elaborate with their staging, costumes, and choreography. The contest seeks to accommodate financial disparity to some extent by varying the participation fee according to the relative size and viewership, which Eurovision describes as the solidarity principle that the strongest shoulders carry the most weight. However, this has also led to the establishment of the Big Five, whose guaranteed grand final spot in exchange for being the largest financial contributors to the contest is often heavily criticised as an unfair advantage. Although many have pointed out that performing in the semi-finals, although risking disqualification, can have its own advantages in terms of, or non-qualification, can have its own advantages in terms of building momentum and rapport with the audience. The rules also determine how we, as the audience, can participate by establishing who we can vote, who we can vote for and when, how votes are cast and tallied. At the end of the day, the intention of the rules is to facilitate a smooth television production of a fair competition. Most famously, Eurovision has specific rules seeking to mitigate the implicit politics of running a contest between nations, which is now further fortified by the Code of Conduct and the Duty of Care guidelines that were developed in response to the various controversies of the 2024 contest. I am, however, just going to focus here on the baseline politics rule. That is, that everyone involved in the contest is responsible for safeguarding the interests and integrity of the ESC, and to make sure that the ESC shall in no case be politicised and or instrumentalised and or otherwise brought into disrepute in any way. Even the rule about non-politicisation seeks to establish a sense of fairness, as politicisation often works on the manipulation or exploitation of public sentiment, which is an important resource in the context of the contest. But the politics rules have demonstrated to be the most difficult to police. There are several reasons for this. First, requests by the EBU for broadcasters and artists to change their entries attracts public attention, sometimes even beyond that which the country might originally have garnered. Israel's October Rain is a good example of this, and Malta's Kant provides a less politically contentious example of this, although that has cultural and linguistic implications that we don't have time to go into here today. Second, even when songs aren't inherently political in lyrics or intention, they can become political due to context cues. For example, Kalush Orchestra's Stefania is an ode to a mother, written, performed, and selected prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, although tensions were indeed high and escalating at that point. Yet because of its timing, both Kalush Orchestra and Stefania become intrinsically tied to the Ukrainian war effort, something that's leaned into in the official music video released strategically after the Eurovision Grand Final, as well as the various activities Kalush Orchestra engaged in to raise funds for and awareness of the war effort. So even though the intention of the song was not political, and in any year before 2022, it would not necessarily have been read as political, it became political because of the specific context into which it was released and performed. And we could argue that pretty much any song Ukraine submitted that year would equally have been politically charged. This links to the third reason. Interpretations of what constitutes political can be highly subjective and can be manipulated or leveraged accordingly. The EBU can only make a case on what can be argued to be political or to have a substantial political interpretation based on the evidence derived initially from the lyrics and later in the staged performance. Again, to use the example of Stefania, the lyrics are not overtly political. Therefore, the song adheres to the contest rules, although we can debate about whether Ola's call for aid at the end of the performance did. What the EBU cannot do is police how others interpret the song subjectively and how that might affect their voting decisions. So, for example, some might challenge me here and say that they would always have seen Stefania as political regardless of the context based on their own subjective interpretation of the song. In contrast, the original title and lyrics for October Rain, which became Hurricane, were deemed to be objectively political. However, even in changing the song to satisfy the reference group's interpretation of the rules, we hit a trifecta in the challenge of policing the politics rule. The depoliticized lyrics were nevertheless still read subjectively by the audience as political due to both the context and due to the attention that was drawn to the entry. The relationship between rules and fairness at Eurovision certainly bore out in the survey that I conducted with 322 Eurofans from July to August 2024. The purpose of the survey was to explore the idea of participatory diplomacy, that is, the extent to which fans can and do use the song contest as an articulation of their own politics and as a means of communicating with both state and non-state actors, such as the EBU. Fairness emerged as a theme in the responses to several of the open-ended questions, and within this, further themes of ethics, transparency, and consistency emerged. For example, when asked how they defined the concept of political, several respondents saw politics as a source of unfair practices in Eurovision, as it led to an uneven or inequitable application of the rules, exclusionary and disrespectful behaviours or practices, and in interfering with the values of the contest, which are universality, diversity, equality, and inclusivity, and the proud tradition of celebrating diversity through music. When asked for how they define non political, fairness, transparency, and consistency, particularly in relation to the application of rules, again emerged. So we can see also some of Rawls's principles of fairness reflected here, such as in the idea that the contest should be run in a way that treats everyone fairly and equitably, where changes are made with consideration of benefiting everyone, and where there is consensus and transparency in the development and application of the rules. Respondents were also given space at the end of each section of questions to provide further commentary if needed. In the general comments responding to the section about politics at the contest, these ideas of fairness and the consistent application of rules re-emerged. In particular, respondents were concerned with whether the rules were adequate to ensure fair play and whether or not these rules were in fact being applied equally and consistently to all participants. In particular, respondents were critical of how the very definition of or assessment of what is political seemed unfair or inconsistent between cases. They also highlighted inequalities in how participants are treated, and in one case there, how some of these problems derive from the power balance of broadcasters from certain geopolitical contexts, and the impact this has on how cultural, political, and economic interests in the contest are managed. As we can see, Israel and Ukraine provide the main geopolitical reference points for considering politics and fairness. This is both because they are very much at the top of fans' minds and also because these are the case studies that my research focused on in the questions, because it was a prevalent comparison in fan and media discourse in 2024. I will, however, note that several fans consistently raised tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan as another example of both politics and unfairness at the contest. However, we shouldn't conclude that fans necessarily saw the ruling on Russia as fair and Israel as unfair, as several respondents pointed out that in some ways, allowing Ukraine to participate while in a war, garnering massive global sympathy, was still unfair, despite being well intentioned. While the majority of participants in the survey agreed that aggressors and conflicts should be excluded from participating in Eurovision, opinion was far more divided on how the non aggressor should be treated. Some argued that it wasn't fair to exclude them while they were under attack, while others, such as these respondents here, suggest that public sympathy provides an unfair advantage. While respondents were highly critical of the EBU's actions and decisions as contravening principles of fairness, many also questioned the extent to which both the voting system and voting practices also adhere to these principles. While many respondents acknowledge that you can't control how or why people vote, they also perceive some systemic unfairness in voting. Respondents identified this in the contest politics, particularly in concerns around voter and jury manipulation and corruption, in the balance between public and jury votes, the impact of technologies such as bot farms, and varying levels of accessibility to voting in different countries, largely due to cost. For example, here we can see concerns about the integrity of the televote system, which currently limits votes to 20 per credit card. As a result, people with more than one credit card can vote more than 20 times, and people with foreign credit cards can contribute to the public vote in other territories. It means that bad actors can use bot farms to vote multiple times using scripts and lists of credit card details. There were also concerns about delegations or their states funding expensive ad campaigns on social media and YouTube. The balance between the jury and public vote is subject to much debate, with mixed feelings about whether the current 50-50 split is fair, as some feel that so-called jury wins, where the winner tops the jury vote but falls lower in the public vote, devalues the public vote. As one respondent states here, I'm getting so sick of my vote essentially being meaningless, as the jury can just determine the winner by themselves. While some see the removal of the jury vote from the semis as a way of mitigating this imbalance, others see this as impacting the quality of the grand final qualifiers. One thing that's interesting to observe is that while juries have historically been seen as easily corruptible, we see increasing concern here that the public vote is no longer entirely trustworthy either. One interesting theme to emerge here is the sense of fairness in terms of the cost of voting and disparity in accessibility to voting in different countries. The cost is considered prohibitive by some, and in some cases can even deter audiences from voting at all, even if they are otherwise invested in the contest and its outcome. This cost, alongside criticisms of sponsors, highlighted a significant concern that the contest is ultimately a commercial enterprise rather than, as its values state, an inclusive celebration of diversity through music. I think one of the great tricks of Eurovision is that it attempts to position these values, universality, diversity, equality, and inclusivity, as both non political and universal, when we know from the very world that we live in that while these values ought to be universal, this is not always the case. They are contested and, importantly, deeply political. Indeed, the very idea of a fair and just society as espoused by rules is a political idea that requires states, institutions like the EBU, and society itself to cultivate and maintain. Several of the respondents in my survey pointed out that both Eurovision and the EBU are products of the geopolitical and economic circumstances in which they were developed and in which they operate. If these circumstances themselves aren't fair, how then can we expect one of its cultural products, Eurovision, to also be so? So thank you for listening, and I look forward to chatting with you all. Thanks.